In 2012, the court heard arguments in Fisher v. University of Texas at Austin, where Abigail Fisher, a white student, challenged the university's consideration of race in the admissions process. The state of Texas passed a law which required the University of Texas to admit all Texas high school students who placed in the top 10% of their class. Fisher was not ranked in the top 10% of her class, and therefore was considered for admission with the regular pool of applications where she was rejected. The court ruled that the University of Texas's admissions program was not a violation of the Civil Rights Act or the Equal Protection Clause because they could demonstrate that racial consideration was narrowly tailored for the purpose of diversity. The court noted that the university should tailor its approach in light of changing circumstances, ensuring that race plays no greater role than is necessary to meet its compelling interests. Part of the reason Abigail Fisher lost her suit was due to her average academic performance. She was in the top 12% of her high school class but had average SAT scores. Her legal team could not show that race played an outsized factor in her rejection. This gave one of the people working on her team an idea. Edward Bloom, an activist, realized that in order to defeat affirmative action, he needed a different victim with better academic performance to file a lawsuit. Edward Bloom is a Jewish former stockbroker who became involved in legal challenges in 1992 when he attempted to run for the House of Representatives in Houston, Texas. His opponent, Craig Washington, was a Black Democrat who initially ran unopposed, and Bloom entered the race as a Republican challenger. As Bloom and his wife started door knocking to promote their campaign, they realized that the district lines were strangely drawn and seemed intended to create a majority Black district. He and others filed a lawsuit which eventually made it to the Supreme Court as Bush versus Vera. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that the Texas districts violated the Voting Rights Act. From there, Bloom became involved in other efforts to challenge the consideration of race in different sectors. In 1997, he was successful in ending the use of race-conscious admissions practices in charter schools within the Houston Independent School District. He eventually founded the Project for Fair Representation and found Abigail Fisher, helping her to file a lawsuit against the University of Texas at Austin, a school which happens to be his own alma mater. He continued filing challenges to district maps around the country. In all of his efforts, he challenges maps drawn by Democratic legislatures, a move he admits was due to the support he received from right-leaning groups and also the tendency of Democrats to be more open about their intention to create majority-minority districts. He was able to bring the case Shelby County versus Holder to the Supreme Court, which led to the overturning of a provision of the Voting Rights Act. Despite his many victories at the Supreme Court, Edward Bloom is not a lawyer. Instead, he uses his talents of organizing to find attractive plaintiffs and skilled legal teams to file lawsuits challenging laws he disagrees with. Ironically, this was a strategy employed by civil rights groups like the NAACP to challenge Jim Crow laws. After Abigail Fisher lost her case, Bloom set up websites harvardnotfair.org, uncnotfair.org, and uwnnotfair.org to recruit Asian plaintiffs willing to sue Harvard University, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, or the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He formed a new organization called Students for Fair Admissions, which filed suits on behalf of the Asian plaintiffs so that they could remain anonymous and avoid reprisals. So far, 3 cases have been filed by Students for Fair Admissions: Students for Fair Admissions versus Fellows of Harvard, Students for Fair Admissions versus University of North Carolina, and Students for Fair Admissions versus University of Texas at Austin.
Here's what I did. I decided right after the Fisher case was decided in 2013 that the next step in this process that began with Alan Bakke applying to medical school back in 1978 would be to challenge outright, to ask the court to end the use of race, period, in the admissions process. What that means is that when David Cow's children apply to Duke or to Stanford or to Yale, on the application, there is no box that should be checked to determine whether you're Asian, whether you're Japanese, whether you're Pakistani, whether you're Indian, whether you're white, black, Hispanic. All those boxes will go away. And rather than have names like Sam Cow or Ed Chen or I don't know, Milton Rabinowitz or Sammy Garcia, all the names are redacted so that people reviewing those applications won't say, aha, here's an Asian, we have too many of those already.
The cases against Harvard University and the University of North Carolina were argued in front of the Supreme Court in October of 2022 and are awaiting the justice's decision. Since the 1990 Office of Civil Rights decision in favor of Harvard, Asian American advocacy groups grew more aware of how affirmative action affected Asian admissions. Part of the reason attempts to overturn Proposition 209 in California failed was due to opposition by such groups. Many claim that Asians are the new Jews, who despite high academic achievement are denied entry in favor of other groups including legacy applicants, athletes, and underrepresented minorities with lower academic scores. Harvard University openly admits that it doesn't consider academic achievement alone, but they vehemently deny that racial bias has any bearing on admissions decisions. Students for Fair Admissions and even Harvard's own records disagree. Students of Fair Admissions found alarming comments made about Asian applicants. One admissions officer said, "Scores in applications seem so typical of other Asian applications I've read. Extraordinarily gifted in math with the opposite extreme in English." Due to Harvard's reputation as the top school with the largest endowment, other schools even outside the Ivy League followed their lead. Also recall that Harvard's admissions program was called out as a positive example by the Supreme Court of how schools could consider race in admissions. Even college test prep companies openly provide advice to Asian students about the realities of the application process. According to Princeton Review, Asian Americans comprise an increasing proportion of college students nationwide. Many Asian Americans have been extraordinarily successful academically to the point where some colleges now worry there are too many Asian Americans on their campuses. Being an Asian American can now actually be a distinct disadvantage in the admissions process at some of the most selective schools in the country. Increasingly, the standard for affirmative action isn't minority status, but underrepresented minority status. Since Asian American populations at many colleges exceed the proportion of Asian Americans to the population of the state or country as a whole, Asian Americans are a minority but not an underrepresented minority at those colleges. If you are an Asian American, or even if you simply have an Asian or Asian-sounding name, you need to be careful about what you do and don't say in your application. A chart of the percentage of enrollment of Asian undergraduate students at Ivy League schools shows the percentages hovering between 15 to 20% year over year. Meanwhile, at schools like California Institute of Technology, or Caltech, that has become known for focusing strictly on academic standards and admissions, almost 40% of undergraduates are Asian. Students for Fair Admissions suggest that there are other race-neutral ways that universities can achieve campus diversity. They say that increasing recruitment of high-achieving community college students may help, since this demographic is more likely to be Latino and African American. They point out that Harvard accepts fewer than 3 transfer students from community colleges each year. They also call out legacy admissions, which they claim amount to about 30% of all admissions. In their complaint, they cite research that legacy admissions do not increase donations to the school. Schools like the University of Michigan say that these and other suggestions cannot achieve the same levels of diversity that consideration of race can during the application process. The school wrote a brief in support of Harvard University and continuing the use of affirmative action. In November of 2006, Michigan voters passed Proposition 2, which prohibits all state colleges and universities from discriminating against or granting preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public education. Since then, the university claims to have seen a drop in African American enrollment of 44% and a drop in Native American enrollment of 90%. The University of Michigan cites many reasons why diversity on campus is important. It increases the exchange of new and interesting ideas and breaks down racial stereotypes. Also, as a public school and more affordable educational option, diversity on campus is critical to shaping the next generation of citizens. They go on to say that many students live in racially homogeneous communities prior to college and attend similarly homogeneous high schools, with only rare opportunities for students to engage across racial or ethnic lines. Neighborhoods and schools are returning to levels of racial segregation not seen since the 1960s, and white students in particular tend to have minimal interaction with people of other racial backgrounds before college. For many Americans, then, college represents the first opportunity for meaningful interaction with people of other races. The University of Michigan also argued that it was unfair to single out race as the one factor that cannot be considered when consideration of other factors like socioeconomic status and geographic location were permitted. They argue that admissions should involve a holistic review of not just an applicant's class rank and grades, but also their character and personality. The school also tried several race-neutral strategies to recruit a diverse pool of students. They maintain an office in Detroit where they could regularly engage with high school students in the local area. They gave consideration to students from poor socioeconomic backgrounds and first-generation college students. They started the Michigan Counseling Advising Corps, which trained recent graduates as counselors and placed them in underserved high schools to encourage students to pursue college. They started a high school visitation program called Wolverine Express, which informs students about academic fields and university resources. They use gaining early awareness and readiness for undergraduate programs, or Gear Up grants, for funds to provide services to low-income high school students in order to raise their educational outcomes. In 2017, the university launched the HAIL, or High Achieving Involved Leader Scholarship, that provides 4 years of full tuition and required fees to high-achieving low-income students. This scholarship was offered in addition to several other financial aid programs made available to low-income students. They committed to a 5-year diversity, equity, and inclusion plan, which included establishing an Office of DEI and hiring a Chief Diversity Officer. They also reduced the number of students admitted under early admissions programs, since they noted that minority applicants who were low income were more likely to apply later. All of these efforts did not significantly increase enrollment of underrepresented minorities. Even though Michigan's Black American student population increased from 16 to 19% from 2006 to 2021, Black undergraduate enrollment at U of M decreased from 7.03% in 2006 to 3.92% in 2021, a reduction of 44%. Native American enrollment was around 1% in 2006 and decreased to 0.11% in 2021, a nearly 90% reduction. The University of Michigan concludes by saying, "There are almost 6 times as many white students as Black students who both come from low socioeconomic status families and have test scores that are above the threshold for gaining admission to an academically selective college or university. Pursuing socioeconomic diversity alone is thus not a realistic strategy for enrolling an academically talented class that is diverse in many ways, including with respect to race. Thus, efforts to increase the representation of lower-income students, while worthwhile in their own right for adding distinctly and uniquely to student experiences with diversity and the behavioral dimension of the campus, simply are not effective in dissipating racial preconceptions and stereotypes, or in providing other benefits resulting from racial diversity." Today, Edward Bloom and Students for Fair Admissions have capitalized on a glaring weakness of affirmative action by framing their arguments in terms of discrimination against a non-white racial group. Because affirmative action was crafted within the confusion and ambiguity of the Jim Crow racial ideology, supporters of the practice are unable to justify why some non-white minorities who have been discriminated against historically are less deserving of affirmative action than others. In their legal complaints, Students for Fair Admissions suggest ending legacy admissions, but observers note that they have not filed a legal challenge against those policies. The policies they seem to challenge the most are related to consideration of race. They also never articulate why consideration of socioeconomic status, geographical origin, or first-generation college status are valid areas of consideration in admissions. Almost all of these factors, like race, are out of a student's control, and stereotypes about these characteristics could also be used to arbitrarily reject students. Their crusade against affirmative action is a part of a larger movement in political conservatism, which makes the average person believe that liberal policies of the 60s are the root of economic and social inequality, as opposed to much older practices which discriminate along racial, religious, and class lines. These are the same practices that many conservative elites also benefit from. Some may argue that schools should only consider academic scores in picking applicants. However, schools need a way to break ties amongst students that all have performed similarly well in classes, on tests, and in academic competitions. Universities are largely responsible for exacerbating this problem by artificially limiting the number of students they enroll in order to make their schools seem more exclusive and prestigious. Still, even changing this will not completely resolve the problem of choosing between similar applicants. Additionally, we can look around the world and observe some of the downsides of a winner-take-all, academically competitive environment. Students in countries like China and South Korea face depression, stress, and anxiety as they attempt to beat out tens of thousands of competitors for coveted spots in state schools, whose admissions are determined strictly on test scores. Small point differences between test scores can mean rejection from school, devastation, and in too many cases, suicide. At universities, which tend to be ideologically liberal, admissions officers use terms like underrepresented minority, diversity, and equity as a means of discussing low wealth and low academic performance of certain ethnic groups. Without universal definitions of these terms, administrators end up evaluating students based on their own assessment of how wealthy and academically gifted the student's racial group is in comparison to white people. Chinese, Indian, Korean, and Japanese students are perceived as privileged domestically and internationally in comparison to Latino and African ethnic groups, even if the individual student's circumstances may differ from these perceptions. This perception may also be erroneously applied to members of other Asian ethnic groups like Burmese people that have comparably lower levels of wealth and academic achievement. Like with Jews in the 1920s, American anxiety about a high-performing, driven, non-white, non-Protestant ethnic group plays a role in the effort to limit their numbers. The underlying fear is that if the top schools become overwhelmingly Asian, that this trend will extend to the business and government sectors. The goal then is not merely diversity, but racial balance, which ensures that everyone gets their fair share. In the opinion of many admissions officers, Asian students have gotten more than enough. Leaders in the Black community continue to defend affirmative action because realistically there aren't alternatives or changes to policy that are politically viable. Affirmative action is an imperfect option to help a few students get into the upper rungs of academia while Black communities scramble trying all manners of strategies to improve Black academic performance across the nation. For Black organizations, 50 years is not enough time to overcome centuries of discrimination. But even defenders of the program within the Black community quietly have pointed out that over time, the majority of its beneficiaries at selected schools tend to be more affluent or tend to be international Black students. Because the goals in terms of affirmative action are so ill-defined, universities are able to present Black students from the diaspora as symbols of progress since American slavery. Once again, the vision of diversity used by admissions officers as a pretext for their decisions doesn't adequately take into account the diverse experiences of different ethnic groups and class distinctions. For them, having a Black student, any Black student, is enough. One also wonders what would happen if immigrant Black students who excel academically started applying to schools in numbers similar to Asian students. Would admissions officers be justified in limiting their enrollment as well? Universities are ill-equipped to correct problems in K-12 funding, housing, and wealth in the Black community. Affirmative action as a part of a package of larger-scale reforms like reparations could be effective. Affirmative action alone is not.